in a world where everything is stacked against you, what can one person, one man, filled with nothing but determination, it's all he has is his name, how far can that man get? Can he overcome the terrible system which is slavery? Could he overcome a concept such as racism? Could he overturn a corrupt court system? I mean, at a certain point, the world will just grind you down, chew you up, spit you out. Right? It happens to a lot of people. It happens to all of us. We all get worn down. But what can truly happen when someone who is bound with nothing with determination, has no ups in life, has nothing to his name except the sheer will? How far can a man get? Edmond Edward Wysinger, a man who started as a slave, and throughout his life he would go on to fight and fight and fight. And the results of him fighting would go on long past his lifespan. Even to this day, it would give hope to millions of school children, opportunities that had not been had before. And it is all directly tied back to one man you've probably never even heard of. Let's dive deep. Edmond Wysinger was born in 1816. His mother was Cherokee, and his father was of African descent. He was born in South Carolina, and soon he would find himself on a plantation. His original name was actually Bush. He was Edmund Bush. But somewhere along the way, he decided to pick up the Wysinger last name from one of his slavers. Now you gotta imagine a man who's half native, half African, and is born into such a corrupt and just not great world. You gotta think about the antebellum days. And he was a slave. And you would think that he would just be downtrodden, that he would not have the will to fight. But he did want to fight, and fight he did. Because while he was stuck on that plantation, an opportunity would soon arise that would change the trajectory of his life and millions of others. The California Gold Rush. See, in 1849, his slavers brought him from South Carolina all the way to California. It's a gold country. See, there's a history, and if you don't know it, let me take you back a little bit. A lot of people who kind of have a basic understanding of history, especially in California, understand that California came in to the Union as a free state, right? They were against slaves, they were against slavery, and something that some people are very proud of today, but the real history, the real answer of why we came in as a free state is a little more complex. Besides the things with, balancing slave states to northern states, one of the biggest factors behind making California a state, and especially a free state, it comes down to one thing: money. The gold that was in the hills. See, one of the fears of early pioneers of California is that slave owners would bring their slave teams in over here to mine gold. You gotta imagine, a lot of these people who came out here looking for gold, And even bigger companies that came in here were looking for gold, to sell out and pay their employees. And so for the fact of them, a bunch of rich Southerners bringing in their sometimes up to thousands of slaves, free labor, to come and look for gold, that just was something that just didn't really jive with them. So they entered California as a free state. But the reality is that there was still plenty of people who brought their slaves to California and made them look for gold. They lied to them. They didn't tell them that they were free, even though the second that they stepped into the state, they should have been. There was a court case later on where some slaves that were informed of their rights realized what were going on and actually sued and were able to get their freedom. I'll put the name up. But for Wysinger, this was not a negative for him. See, because when he came over, he was working with about 100 other slaves in a surface mine up in Grass Valley. That's up east of Sacramento, up in the foothills. And his slavers had offered him a deal. $1,000 for his freedom. And you might sit there and be like, $1,000 in 1849 is insane, right? Even 100 years ago, $1,000 was an insane amount of money. And so $1,000. And he did it within a year. A year of hard work, of mining in the hills, in that toxic environment. In 1 year, he was able to buy his freedom. And this man, now finally a freed man, he wasn't freed by the law. He wasn't freed by, people wanting to set him right. He freed himself. He was offered a deal, and he worked like hell to be free. After freeing himself from his captivity, he still kept his old slaver's last name. And he made a little trip down south, down from the foothills into California's Central Valley. He ended up in what was, at the time, a little pioneer town called Merced. And he ends up in Merced, where at some point he meets Panisia Wilson. She is the daughter of the Wilsons, freed people from the state of Missouri. And he eventually gets married to her in 1864. And by 1871, they had moved down to Visalia, California. Visalia was admittedly not the best place for Black people. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but the state of California kind of has a divisive path. A lot of people today think about progressivism and, moving forward and, fighting the good fight against, the establishment. But this, at one point, during the 20th century, is a very red state. And one of the main reasons behind it is because it wasn't just Northerners who came here. It was, in fact, a lot of Southerners as well. And they kind of brought those systems into California. In certain parts of California, there was real issue. I believe in Fresno, in the 20s, they had a Klan rally, which is a whole thing. But, it serves the purpose of, it wasn't just this group of people is in this, it was a very mixed history. Visalia itself was a pretty complex place. Even during the Civil War, the community was taking both sides, and there was some issues with that. They even had a pro-South newspaper called the Equal Rights Expositor. Expose. I'm putting the name up on screen. I can't. I cannot. I don't know. Not. I do not know how to say that word. But there was some real. There was some real Southern influence there, and even for those who weren't Southerners, North versus South is one thing. You can argue about it as two white guys, but when a black dude shows up, especially during those times, you really see where the apprehension really lies. But nonetheless, that was Edmond's home. That's where he was going to live. He had 8 children. That's where he raised his kids. In 1888, Edmond was 72 years old. He was a laborer, he was a preacher, he was raising his children. And what was so special about this year is the Wysinger School District had decided to build a new school. Because at this point, they had just a couple little schoolhouses, and it really wasn't a whole lot, nothing to be impressive. And so they bought an anchor and they built this grand old schoolhouse. The issue with the schoolhouse, though, is that it was explicitly for the white children of that community. See, this was at a time that even predates the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And if you're not familiar about that, it was basically the foundation for the South to justify separate but equal. Right? It was, that was where we had different color water fountains. We had, different bathrooms. See, at the time, you have to realize that this was a post-14th Amendment United States. They just got off the Civil War. Black people were considered human across the board, but that sentiment wasn't really carried on by a lot of the people there. They just didn't want to intermix like that. And so, separate but equal was a informal policy that was really just the rule of thumb. It wasn't explicit, but it was just how they did things. The thing is Edmond did not care about that system. See, his older children, they had grown up learning, and their schoolhouse was quite literally a barn. It was a shack on some black farmer's property. And so when his 12-year-old son, Arthur, was ready to go to school, he wanted to enroll his boy in a good school where he could actually learn and get properly educated. So he went to the new school, or he went to the district, and he said, I want to sign my son up for the new school. And the district looked at him and was just like, nah, we're not going to do it. So he took it to the county court. And of course, the county court, being made up of mostly white people, or I believe all white people likely at the time, said no. So then he went and tried and filed an appeal. And his appeal was denied. And this is at most part, for a lot of black people living in a a post-Reconstruction America, they were very disenfranchised. You got to remember, this is when they had those voting tests and the poll fees, and were just trying everything they could do to disenfranchise black people from participating in society. And so a lot of black people just gave up because it was too hard, there's too much pressure, there's too many death threats. Edmond did not give a flying fuck. Edmond took it all the way to the California Supreme Court. And the California Supreme Court looked at the findings, they looked at the evidence, and they realized their hands were kind of tied. See, the issue is that there was no structure to punish these black folk, to restrict them from the school. See, about a decade earlier in 1880, they had actually signed an amendment to the school bill, which basically had taken out which basically was like all children, I think 5 to 21, are allowed to be in the district. but it said white children. But this amendment took off the white children's part, and it really gutted several of the other provisions that allowed them to discriminate against black and native children. Chinese children were different because there was actually a law that had been passed by a state legislator that had allowed that. But for black and natives, there was no law. There was nothing at the state level that gave the schools the power to do that. And in fact, the state level that amendment, and in fact, the amendment that had changed it from white children to just children, had effectively gutted any power that the districts had to enforce. See, the thing is the districts were enforcing power that they actually didn't have. They were just enforcing the old system. Their powers had been taken away a decade prior. And the Supreme Court, whether they agreed with it or not, sided with the black native man and said, nah, you gotta let us kid into the school. The unfortunate part is while he did win, Edmond would die a year later. He was 74, 75 years old, which is pretty impressive, especially during those times. But even though he never got to see his son enter that school, his son did attend. He attended Wysinger School. While it may not have seemed like a big one at first, the Wysinger case would set the grounds for a change. See, what that case did is it set a statewide protection for black and native children. And it was the basis for desegregating schools in this state. Now, for a long time, people still chose largely to go to their schools, right? The black kids went to one school, the white kids went to other school, and that was a decision made on behalf of both parents. Not that there wasn't any, kids that would switch over and jump ship and, go to different schools, but they largely stayed to their racial groups. It wasn't until the 70s when California pushed even harder to deregulate schools with the busing program and whatnot that there was really true integration. But it did protect the rights of the children, as no state laws would ever come to force them to not be able to participate. And it was bigger than California school children, as this was one of the cases that was cited in the Brown decision, which ultimately allowed for black children and really all children of color to freely enter these, freely be able to attend whatever school. This little case in this little podunk town from one dad who was just really upset and really, I wouldn't say angry, but he was determined. He was determined to get his child a proper education. And his results were the starting point for millions of other children to have a good education as well. It may not have seemed like that much first, but this man who started in slavery, he was a miner. This man freed himself from slavery. And at the end of his life, he got the ball rolling on what would be one of the most landmark court decisions of the 20th century. This one guy that you've certainly never heard of. And it was all because he was determined, because he would not give up, because he worked hard, and he wouldn't quit. And while he never got to even live to see his own son enter that schoolhouse, I think that is something that we can all admire and look up to. Thank you.